And we've seen this historically in lots and lots of different situations, and Alberto's going to talk a bit about that in Latin America, I think, because it's one of the places where this has kind of been used as a tactic, a kind of shock doctrine for pushing forward a certain agenda. But all across the world, and we're going to hear, as I said, we're going to hear a bit about the Latin American and the international context, and then we're going to hear particularly about the energy sector and fossil fuel companies, and then about the care sector and a more localized Scottish perspective, and how particularly unions are responding to that. So a really broad range of topics. And as I said, we'll get to Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, just write them down or keep them in your head. And I'm going to pass on to Alberto, who's going to start us off with the talks for tonight. Go ahead. You need to unmute, Alberto. You should be able to unmute yourself. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Welcome, everybody. It's only 3 o'clock here in Montevideo in Uruguay. It's getting late for you guys. So Kate asked me to talk about the global and the Latin American picture of how big business uses moments of shock to profit. That's a lot of terrain to cover. No, but we can start with Naomi Klein saying that disaster or reconstruction capitalism kicks in the aftermath of wars, natural disasters, or economic crisis, or I would say even revolutions. To explain what I'm talking about, no? I mean, wars, already in the Second World War, there was a big program, the Marshall Plan, no? That recuperated all the German industry, no? That came into place also in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, where we have the way that Halliburton and contracts were given to US firms and the like, no? During natural disasters in Katrina, in the US, no? And during economic crisis, I will share you some thoughts about what happened in Argentina in 2001 and 2002. And in the aftermath of that huge economic crisis that came to being exactly because of the neoliberal policies that had been installed during the 90s by neoliberal governments at that time. No, in Argentina at that time there was the biggest economic crisis after the dictatorship. No, I mean the shock doctrine really came into force in Latin America, not only in Chile, but also in Argentina and in many of the countries in Latin America, no? And all these military dictatorships installed neoliberal policies from the Chicago Boys. So after this huge crisis, the government's response to it was to default its debt, no? To devalue its currency, no? And to freeze the public services tariffs, no? So that gave rise to I mean, after public services were privatized during the neoliberal era in the 90s, no, 42 transnational corporations that were operating public services, mainly, no, initiated lawsuits against the Argentinian government for lost profits and lost future profits under different bilateral investment treaties, no, bilateral investment treaties of which there are around 3,000 in the world, no. And for that, I mean, and these bilateral investment treaties, they allow for what I'm sure most of you know about the investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, no? Where private investors, private foreign investors can sue the government for whatever public policy they deem or think that is impeding their profits. No, that happened. No. Argentina since then has had, I mean, from then on has had 62 cases against it. It's the government that has had the most ISDS cases against it. No, most of them in the aftermath of this crisis and the measures it took to help its population go through the crisis. No, and it has had to pay $9.3 billion in reparations to these transnational corporations. Now, the biggest of those lawsuits, or the biggest payment they had to make was $5 billion to Repsol, the Spanish oil company. No, Just to shortly tell you about one particular case that came out in this period, was National Grid, a UK-based company, sued under the UK-Argentina bilateral investment treaty. Argentina, sued Argentina for what they had. For the measures they had taken in the 2000 and 2001 crisis. Now, the government measures was until that time the government had 1-to-1. The currency exchange was 1 Argentinian peso was equivalent to $1. And they had to devaluate and end that policy, so that it was the pacification, it was called. So shortly after, $1 was worth 3 pesos. And the tariffs and that the government policy to tackle the crisis was that these corporations couldn't take their tariffs in dollars but in pesos, so they lost 2/3 of their income in that way, and they couldn't. Also the package included that the possibility to renegotiate the public utility contracts. Most of these companies didn't want to renegotiate the public utility companies. They resorted instead to these international shaky tribunals, very phantom tribunals, private economic tribunals, not the public tribunals. And the tribunals, they said, okay, this is Argentina has breached the bilateral investment treaty provisions on fair and equitable treatment, which are very broadly drafted provisions, up to the discretion of the 3 arbiters that are set in these tribunals. And they were forced then to pay 44 million plus interest. Then they had to pay to the arbiters 1.1 million, and they had to pay legal costs for worth more than $5 million, and to the ICSID, which is the World Bank fora, or the World Bank fora, where these tribunals, most of these tribunals and most of these ISDS cases take place. They had to pay $2,000 and $70,000 to these people. So it's a lot of money, and this is just, this was a small lawsuit, As I told you, the biggest one that Argentina had to pay was $5 billion. However, aside from Argentina, another shock, or as I was telling you, it's not only national disasters or economic crisis, but another shock for, at least for the companies, for transnational corporations, is whenever governments want to prioritize people before profits. And that was exactly what happened with the governments in the past 15 years, at the beginning of the 2000s. Where Argentina, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia had, all of them, and other countries in the region had progressive governments that gave priority to people and not to profits, and took back control over their natural resources and their public services and many things. The consequence of that is that many corporations also sued these 4 countries. So out of the total of 282 lawsuits that corporations had launched in Latin America against governments, those 4 countries with progressive governments got more than half of them, 156 demands, or challenges for their good public interest policies, worth $29 billion, that they have had to pay. Out of them, $17.5 billion have been paid by these 4 countries to mainly oil companies, or to oil companies: Conoco, Repsol, Occidental, and Mobil. 3 from the US and 1 from Spain. Those, in fact, the biggest payments that governments have had to make has been always to oil companies. Okay. Just to dimension this thing, it's really, 2/3 of the $32 billion that the Latin American countries have had to pay to companies, according to these tribunals. 2/3 of that money would be sufficient to eliminate extreme poverty in the whole of Latin America. Okay, that for in terms of Latin America, no. But I mean, under now the coronavirus, there's also, I mean, another avenue, or I mean, ISDS threats are already on the runaway, no. For governments, no. I mean, governments under the coronavirus measures, they have restricted non-essential services. They had restrictions on travel and movement. They have had issued compulsory licenses on medicines, on equipment, on things. No, they have nationalized infrastructure and hospitals. No, they are screening foreign investment. No, they are restricting exports, and they are doing bailouts. No, all of these measures. No, are actually up for grabs for big corporations or foreign corporations to sue national governments for those measures. No? And actually, there's a whole host of law firms, no? Which is another sector that has a very high interest in the ISDS system, no? Because they get a lot of money. No? I mean, lawyers in doing arbitration or counsel for countries, no? They earn as much as $3,000 per hour. No? So there's a lot of money there for them. No? So they have an interest, no, and they are always okay. They're always advising their clients, their transnational corporate clients, no, to I mean, and really they are almost forced, no, not forced, but it's their obligation, no, because the only obligation and responsibility that corporate CEOs and bodies have is to secure the profits of their investors. No? So in times like this one, no, a way to secure the investments of this of the investors is to go to court and sue governments for any of these measures. No? And there's a whole host of law firms that are already doing so. No, and already Peru in Latin America, no, has been advised and threatened, and Peruvian officials have been warned that the suspension of the toll fees in the road system, no, could result in multiple ISDS cases. No, so and what to do about this? No, okay, in civil society, I mean, there has been several people issuing statements about this, no, that there should be a moratorium on all arbitration claims, a suspension of all trade and investment agreements, no, termination of these bilateral investment treaties, no, and a civil society. I mean, last week there was a global call, no, so we will be and look for it, no, to sign on when we issue it, a global sign on to demand these kind of things, no. So that the ISDS is not used under the pandemic, you know, to offer an avenue for corporates to benefit. No? There are many other, I mean, and I have 7 of them, other avenues under crisis, under shock, by which corporations want to profit. No? One is, I mean, currently, and I will just name it very, very shortly and ask and say, okay, what to do about them. No? One is the outflows of capital, financial capital that has been flowing out of emerging economies is in the tune of 70 billion, up to, I mean, since the outbreak of the coronavirus, up to March 25 only, when the G20 was meeting. You know? And that's double as much as the outflows that happened during the 2008 financial crisis. No? I mean, okay, this is, some governments might want to and should actually be restricting those outflows, no? And what to do about it? I mean, okay, we need to demand our governments to regulate capital outflows, no? To establish capital controls, which is totally the contrary of what the financiers and the financial sector bank is demanding at the WTO and other free trade negotiations, where they want unrestricted capital flows through countries, no? And also another avenue, just to mention another one very shortly, bailouts. I mean, the top 5,000 transnational corporations in the world have down-toned their earnings perspectives for 2020 up to 30%. The hardest hit sectors are energy industries, which they expect they will lose 208% of their perspective. No, airlines minus 116%, no? And automobile industry minus 47%. All of these industries are at the top list of the lobbyists pushing for bailouts in governments. Not only bailouts, no, but also the lobbying, and there's a very good briefing by Corporate Europe Observatory, no, on a European lobbying in that regard. And just yesterday or the day before yesterday, friends of the US briefing also on oil lobbyists, no, wanted to get tax cuts, fiscal cuts, no, and labor and safety regulations delayed or weakened. No? All of this also obviously impacts directly in their profits. No? It will, because if they don't have to apply those regulations or things, I mean, they will have to, it will be less costly for them. So, I mean, no bailouts without conditions, no bailouts to what to do, no bailouts to polluting industries, no, and conditional bailouts on the conditions that the industries that are given bailout funds, no, provide good jobs to their employees and the like, no, and yeah, okay, another just going down the line very shortly. Yes, abusive pricing in the retail sector, no. I mean, that happens, I'm sure, in every country. That's happening. That's happening in our country. You know, there's big supermarket chains which are protected by the government. No, they are doing abusive practices. We need to demand price controls of basic food products and health products to confront the coronavirus. No? Patents and the intellectual property rights on medicines, equipment, anything that has to do with confronting and facing the coronavirus, no, that needs to be waived, no, under the coronavirus, so that any vaccines, for example, that come out that are in the pipeline, no, will be accessible for all. Otherwise, I mean, half of the population of the world will probably have to die or whatever, no, of the coronavirus, because they cannot afford, the governments cannot afford to pay those patents. No, corporate mergers and acquisitions under this coronavirus. I mean, lots of companies, small and medium-sized companies, are going bankrupt. No, and big corporations are taking the chance to buy them at the peanut prices. No, they had to increase the consolidation and their power. No, so we need to demand no mergers and acquisitions under coronavirus. No, and one of those industries, and the biggest, or the industry that is most profiting from the coronavirus, is big tech, e-commerce platforms. No, that are going huge. No, they are going. I mean, there was just yesterday a Naomi Klein thing in the Financial Times or the Guardian, I think. No, specialists working on this in India have talked about that. Bread for the World in Germany has put out some documents. I will share all this, the information I have, with Kate, so that she can share with you also the sources and everything. No, but it's huge. No, so I mean, what to do? Just ending now. No. To face all this, I mean, what we are doing here in the first place at the national level in Uruguay, we are establishing cross-sectoral alliances, no, with worker unions, with food cooperatives, with housing cooperatives, no, with small and medium-sized enterprises and people without stable work, anything, no, to demand all these things from government. No, we need international solidarity, no. I mean, and multilateral solutions, because I mean, unless those multilateral and international solidarity solutions are in place, I mean, the fate that we face here in countries, because we don't have the funds that the European Union has, or the US has, to give out a $2 or $3 trillion program. No, we will face what we are facing. No, very right-wing governments, kind of almost coming back to soft. Not very soft dictatorship again, like in the 1990s or in the 1970s during the establishment of the shock doctrine. No? And also demand also that binding regulation on TNCs, so that they don't just grow more and more powerful every time. We cannot return to business as usual. No, we need global system change, and perhaps, yeah. In Europe, I know you're discussing a European Green New Deal, no? We still have to discuss about what that is, no? But unless it's a global Green New Deal, no? And a global New Deal that is of the type of the Marshall Plan, which benefit the German industry, not the US industry as was the funds during Iraq or Afghanistan war, no? There's no chance for us in the developing world. Well, I'm through and much over my time. Thank you very much, Kate. I'm sorry.
No, you were over your time, but I couldn't stop you. Too good.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much. Lots and lots in that, and it would be really great if you can share some of the resources and we can circulate them. And I think it's really interesting to hear what you're doing in Uruguay. Like there's similar initiatives happening in the UK and Scotland. I think we'll talk about those a bit at the end if we have time. But I'm going to pass on to Ben to talk about what's happening in the UK around the energy industry and fossil fuels.
Hey, I'm Ben. I'm from Dublin, but I live in London and I work for a platform who are a collective. And we work on a variety of campaigns, predominantly focused on the global oil industry, fossil fuel finance, and building capacity towards climate justice and energy democracy. So I've been asked to look at how the industry deals with crises, what their lobbying looks like, and how we should expect to see this in the future. I'm going to do this by looking at past crises, specifically in the oil sector, from the 70s, 2010, 2014, and the present crisis. I'll try and keep it quite quick and brief and just give you a brief overview of what's happened and what we kind of need to be aware of and what we can learn from this. So the first thing to say is that fossil fuel companies are really used to crises. The price of oil has varied hugely over time. Just think of the price over the last 100 years. It goes up and down massively. So these companies have experience and the money for crashes like this one. Companies like Shell and ExxonMobil have been planning for global warming for decades. Like, not only did they know about this, but they actually funded climate change denial to lobby against the most modest climate policies. And when we kind of come to think about how fossil fuel companies plan for these things, it's important to be aware that they don't focus on the immediate problem, like a 50% price drop, but instead they look at how they can use this crisis to their own ends. So they're not dealing with something that's going to happen in the next 6 to 12 months, but seeing what they can gain in 2, 5, or 10 years' time. So they can use this time to push governments. I'm going to go quite quickly to an example from the 70s. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this, so I'll keep it quite quick. In 1974, the British state owned 68% of BP. The Minister for Energy at the time was Tony Benn, and he wants to take BP into fuller nationalisation and use the profits in much the same way that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund would do, partially by slowing down the rapid pace of development of the oil fields. He was deeply committed to strengthening the roles of trade unions in industry and to expanding industrial democracy in all parts of the economy. So here we have a relatively new sector in the UK at the time, that is like the offshore industry, that for a decade had followed American culture in which the companies resisted deunionization of the workforce on the rigs and in the construction yards. But Ben wanted to change this, and BP were absolutely determined that it would not be the case. So they resisted his plans, and then in June in 1976, the Prime Minister, Callan, reveals that the Chancellor is in negotiations with the IMF for one of the largest bailouts in the post-war era. The IMF demanded changes to the way the UK economy worked as a condition for a loan, and BP lobbied hard for 6 months to include selling off of 17% back to BP, and they won. The IMF crisis had given BP the opportunity to win what they'd fought for 2.5 years to achieve. It's not hard to imagine that they're kind of waiting for this, knowing it was going to happen. And then 2 years later, Thatcher came to power, and immediately the new Tory energy minister, David Howell, and BP set to work on a further sale of BP shares, raising £290 million for the government and reducing the state's holding in BP to less than 46% in only 6 months. So that's kind of an example from the past. And now we're going to look at a case from 2010 in the North Sea oil. So since the 60s, when the discussion around North Sea oil began, there was always an idea or a question of who would pay for the cleanup or the decommissioning. The question of what would happen to the seabed was nearly debated for 50 years. And obviously the oil companies really wanted to make the state pay. They weren't doing very well at convincing the governments of this. But after 2008 and 2009 global financial crisis, when oil prices had fallen drastically, these companies claimed to be on the ropes again. They took that opportunity to convince the then Minister of the Treasury that the state should pay for almost half of the bill, which is estimated to be about £60 billion. So they've been waiting to do this for years, no one was listening, and then at a moment of crisis, both for the UK government and also, more importantly, for these oil companies, they used this crisis to get the government to sign legal guarantees to prevent any future elected government from changing the tax rules. And already by 2019, the Treasury had committed £357 million to covering one company's default on this. I mean, like, this stuff is just ridiculous and you couldn't make it up, really. And then the next crisis I'm going to look at briefly is the 2013-2014 one, and how the Scottish government responded in this case. So in 2014, there was kind of a price war between Saudi Arabia and the US shale industry, and there was overproduction, and at one point oil prices fell down to $14 a barrel. And it was estimated that there was a loss of 75,000 offshore and onshore support jobs in the industry and the surrounding area. And then during this downturn, the Scottish government took the decision to respond to the crisis by establishing the Transition Training Fund, as I'm sure many of you are aware. It was basically set up to maintain the highly skilled energy workforce in the North Sea region by offering grants to individuals to support their redeployment through retraining or further education, but crucially, only for such retraining and education in the oil sector. And by 2019, 68% of participants in the scheme had kept their jobs or gained new ones in the sector, but the fund was wound up around then. And I think this kind of clearly illustrates how, while the giant fossil fuel companies are planning for decades, the government bodies involved only think in cycles of a couple of years or more. And at the moment, there's no kind of plan for the government to reinstate the fund or provide further training or assistance to oil and gas workers to transition to non-fossil fuel work. And I think this is pretty clear from government policy. I think in 2019 it was that Nicola Sturgeon said, the North Sea will continue to produce oil for decades to come. It still contains up to 20 billion barrels of recoverable reserves. Our primary aim, and I want to underline this and emphasize this, our primary aim is to maximize the economic recovery of those reserves. So what we see here is a government that will respond to a crisis in the oil industry by paying to retrain workers for what they perceive to be a key sector, but won't pay for training to transition these workers to other key clean energy industries. So that's kind of looked at how the oil industry has responded in two cases, and also looked at how the Scottish government has responded to training in the most recent case in 2014. But if we look at what's going on in the present, and kind of the last example I'll talk about, which began before COVID-19, but has clearly intensified since. Like any crisis, COVID has reminded us how precarious all livelihoods are. At the moment, it is estimated that globally, more than 1 million workers who provide oil field services will likely lose their jobs in 2020. And in terms of the North Sea workforce, there have been a growing number of layoffs, and employers have brought in hiring freezes over the last few months. And the North Sea in particular is not an attractive position. Close to a quarter of fields are running at a loss, and any early shut-ins would accelerate the £20 billion decommissioning spending. The number of workers operating platforms on any given pre-crisis day would normally be about 11 to 12,000, but at the most recent estimates, and these are probably out of date already, is about 7,000. All non-essential work has been cancelled, and companies have cut down to a skeleton crew. Not only does this mean thousands of layoffs, it also suggests dangerous health and safety standards. And it has already been reported that 200 workers at least have been let off work with suspected COVID symptoms. And if you think of the kind of conditions these people work in like very close quarters with one another, and also sleeping in the same bunkers, it's, I'd be amazed if the figure wasn't actually higher. Overall, the case is that the cost per barrel in the North Sea oil is extremely high, and many fields are reaching the end of their life stage anyway. If the industry does go into harvest mode, a premature end is definitely a possibility. But the crisis could lead to the oil industry receiving quite a lot of support from the public purse. In the US, the industry has effectively been bailed out already. And as we have seen before, the fossil fuel companies here are never willing to let a good crisis go to waste. The industry group Oil and Gas UK have argued that without government support, there would be 30,000 jobs lost in the next 9 to 12 months permanently. And that's just kind of almost directly involved in oil, not to do with what surrounds it. The industry in the UK has long benefited from government support via tax breaks and other means. So I think we need to be clear, when we speak of a bailout, it's important to be clear that this has already been happening for years. Companies like Shell and BP have received more money in government subsidies than we make from them in tax over the last few years. So on top of the environmental disruption, it is costing us money just to have them here. And now Oil and Gas UK are making the case for even further bailouts, and they've threatened that all these jobs will be lost. But they also, interestingly, claim that the offshore oil sector is absolutely essential in leading the way to a net zero transition. And it will develop kind of carbon capture technology, hydrogen power, and offshore wind better than anyone else. But this is interesting because I've never really been interested in doing this before, despite what they kind of advertise. They spend much less than 1% of their budget on this annually. And I think we have to be really careful in the present about what is going to happen and be aware of what could happen. Oil and Gas UK are positioning themselves as essential on the road to a just transition. But this is a bit like tobacco companies saying that they should take a lead on getting people to quit smoking. And we know how that's worked out in the past. And just to be really clear, this crisis isn't a momentary blip. I think it is different to what has come before, if not for the entire oil industry, but specifically for the North Sea case. Goldman Sachs have said that the oil market remains massively oversupplied and the prices will continue to go down. But there is still some hope. The principal asset of that industry is its workforce, and it could easily, with enough kind of support from both unions and the government, could easily be redirected to a green economy and be like the backbone of growing renewable infrastructure. The Scottish government has shown a willingness to do this in the past, and it's not to say that they couldn't do it again. And I guess, basically to sum up, what we need now is a government-funded, worker-led just transition, or the continual state of crisis that we have seen in the North Sea from the 70s, 2010, 2014, and at the moment will continue. And the challenge really, I think, with these things is we have found out about all the crises that have happened in the past and the kind of basically secret negotiations that have happened between oil companies in the UK and the government. We tend not to find out about them afterwards. And that's the challenge, is the present, is to follow every detail super closely and be prepared to resist as much as possible when it looks like a bailout like this is going to happen. And kind of, conditions are going to be locked in for the future that we won't be able to get out of, like has happened in the past. So yeah, that's kind of everything. But thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, we can definitely see that a lot of these industries are prepping up. We saw that Jim Ratcliffe has asked for a massive bailout for petrochemical plant at Grangemouth, which is definitely something that we'll be keeping an eye on. So finally, I want to introduce Carmen, who some people might be on this and they're like, why is Friends of the Earth Scotland asking someone from a care work union to come and talk about this? Like, what's the link? But obviously, as Alberto really and Ben really clearly explained, these crises are so linked. This has shown us that everyone's work is, and everyone's livelihoods, or a lot of our livelihoods, is kind of on a brink, and that the way that corporations are responding to this puts workers all across different sectors at risk. And as Alberto said, the way out of this is cross-sectoral. It's working together. It's working with unions, working with workers. So we thought it was really, really important that we get a perspective from someone who is kind of working in one of the key worker fields at the moment. So I'm going to pass on to Carmen. Are you there? Can you unmute? Yeah. Hi. Go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction, Carmen. I was actually thinking exactly what you were saying. I don't know what I'm going to say is going to kind of fit into the rest of the speeches. I'm gonna start just talking about a little bit about the branch. I do work for Unite Non-for-Profit branch, and we represent members not just for the care sector, but also Friends of the Earth. Funny enough, is part of our branch as well. But I'm gonna kind of focus on care work, and I'm gonna focus on care in the community. Okay, the care sector is been in crisis before the pandemic. It's something that happened back with Tony Blair and the Labour government, and at the point where the NHS, but health and social care kind of divided, and social care was left in the hands of private companies and charities. The problem with care being in the hands of charities and the third sector is being what is called the race to the bottom in this commissioning process, in which providers are forced to bid for contracts looking at profit or not profit, looking at how can you manage to provide a service at a very low cost and leaving service users or clients, as I call them, in a second role. Okay, so I think we need to bear that in mind. We've been facing a crisis for a long time. The social care sector is a social care that is underpaid, is undervalued. Terms and conditions are getting worse and worse, and part of it is due as well to this casualization of the work with the 0-hour contract, casual workers. I think I do work as well as a care worker. I do support work for adults with multiple needs. And I think that personally, I have a good example of who works in my sector is a woman, migrant, that has a few part-time jobs in order to be able to pay the bills at the end of the month. Okay, so that's kind of, in Scotland, 83% of the care provided in the social care is delivered by women. Is that the gender imbalance is something the sector has to work on, because it's huge. Just to have a wee glimpse of terms and conditions, I've been working in this area since 2008. My wages are worse now than they were back in 2008. So that's how this race to the bottom has impacted terms and conditions for workers. I think that we all are aware in the news about the impact of COVID-19 in NHS workers, and rightly so, and also in care homes where a lot of residents have died. And that would be a theme for another webinar in itself. But as a care, I think there's some areas of care that have been forgotten in this pandemic, and it's been the care that is provided by workers in the community. Okay, like care at home, housing support, or supported accommodation. And it's something that our branch have picked up. As a development worker, I have contacted members and union reps, and it was clear to us that there was an area within our sector that was being impacted like really badly. The main issues that we have recorded from care workers has been the lack of PPE. I'm assuming that everybody is aware with those terms. I'm happy to clarify. I mean, PPE is protective, personal protective equipment. The lack of PPE, the lack of training of using PPE properly. It's no point of having masks if you cannot use them properly. Actually increases the risk of infection. And the lack of clear guidelines from the government on how to do our job properly in the community. Again, just as a note, the first guidelines that is being published by the government about how to do our job properly and safely in the community has been published on the 5th of May. And I believe it's been partly due to the pressure of unions and providers. And this guideline is not perfect. I think that it needs to be amended, and it's also just been published in English. And one of the issues that we have been raising through the union is the lack of lack of information that is accessible to migrant workers, bearing in mind that in the social care, there's an important percentage of workers that whose English is not the first language. So I think there is things to improve in that area. So I think I read a couple of articles that for me has been kind of an eye-opener. These articles, they talk mainly about England and Wales. There is still some stuff that should come up from Scotland. But one of them is that the rate of death amongst care workers is twice the death rate of health workers. And the other one is that key workers with a Black and ethnic minority background have been disproportionately impacted by death during the crisis. So I think that's something that would keep, that should make us think about what are we doing wrong, I think. And then Kate and Ryan asked me to talk about what are we doing from the branch and from the union. As I mentioned at the beginning, our branch, we represent people from the social care field, but we also represent people from other backgrounds. And on top of all the issues of the COVID-19 has generated, there is like the day-to-day work. There's issues with maternity leave, sick pay, change with terms and conditions, etc., etc. But particularly with the COVID-19, what we did from the very beginning was try to educate ourselves about what was going on. There was probably a period of 3 weeks, and it's an ongoing thing, that things are changing really, really quickly. Government rules are changing, legislation is changing, guidelines are changing. So there's a lot of work to be done just to keep up with all those changes in order to be able to inform and support members properly. We made, I think, a big effort to share this information with members through emails, through the Facebook group. We kept the branch meetings through Zoom as well. I think it was important, this kind of social isolation, to have to keep those branch meetings going. Actually, they were better attended than the ones that we have face to face. We also liaise with regional and national officers, because as Kate was mentioned before, and this is impacting everybody. So you need the support from the structures above. We through the branch, we are affiliated to the TUC, and we are also part of what is called now COVID-19 committee in Edinburgh. That is a group of union reps and mainly union reps and health and safety reps that we are getting together to discuss on a weekly basis what are the issues. So the branch, like, participating in these two platforms, if you will. We have contacted the NSPs, councillors. We put a deputation, a so-called deputation, in the council today, and just bringing forward the agenda of social care and work in the community. I think in general it's a great opportunity for the union and for the branch, for the care workers to put forward our agenda. I think that now we have public support, and I think it's the right time to organize and to contact other unions that represent care workers in order to present a coherent agenda. And one of the things that is in the mind of the unions at the moment is to get sectoral bargaining. One of the issues, amongst others, in the care sector is that there is a really low level of people, members of the union, for many reasons, and it would be complex to try to explain what that is. But it's really difficult to organize a workforce that is scattered in the community. but I think I'm really positive about how we can use this terrible situation with a constructive approach, and to bring social care to the place that it belongs, that is valued and is well paid and is where it should be. And that's everything. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carmen. It's a weird thing on Zoom that you can't really like clap people. You can do little reactions, or you can put a clap for all the speakers. So we've only got 4 minutes before the clap. My Q&A was massively squished, but it's fine. Maybe we can get time for one question. So if you're quick with your question mark in the chat, I'll take a question before the break. Oh, great. Someone's just been encouraged to join Unite. What a great,
Well,
a great plug for
that's something.
Everyone should join a union.